In the year 2000, we had 130 reporters in the newsroom. In the year 2009, we have about 119. So we've lost 11 reporters, all of whom came out of our feature staff. That's true. Meanwhile, we have exactly the same number of reporters devoted to local news in 2009 as we had in 2000. We have twice as many reporters devoted to investigative journalism in 2009 as we had in 2000. Just this weekend, we had a tremendous series that started looking at the 1,000 and more people who fell to their death in nursing homes, an underserved population, and we're getting tremendous response from our readers. Yes, the business model has some struggles, but all of journalism is not broken.
How about the issue that Pat brings up with respect to younger people?
Well, you're talking about platforms, I think. We should be in this business platform agnostic. So if you want to talk about us as a newspaper, then yes, we will be a dying organization because over time, fewer and fewer people are going to read newspapers. However, we still sell 500,000 newspapers alone on Sunday. Younger people, they'll come to us on the web. We built a mobile site several years ago because I saw this change coming because I have teenage daughters and I know they consume all of their news either online or now on their mobile phone. The younger people and some of the more diverse audiences will come to us on different platforms. When we write stories, for example, about the Somali community, we know they don't buy the paper, and so we make sure that those stories are available online because they will read us online.
Great. Rich?
If the suggested downward spiral was relating to traditional media entities, then I accept it fully. If the downward spiral suggests an attendant decline in the richness of information and knowledge available to people, then I would disagree fully. I mean, I look out at the landscape today, and I see great examples that I think are indicative of what the future will likely bring. I see the investigative reporting efforts of Josh Marshall in Talking Points Memo, who won the George Polk Award for their efforts on the U.S. Attorney scandal. Hungry little shop buried in a seedy little office on 6th Avenue. I see the efforts of Adrian Halvardi and everyblock.com surfacing civic information that has never been surfaced that way before. Is it journalism? No. Is it important data that journalists can build upon with analysis? Absolutely. I mean, I think these are great reasons for optimism. I frankly would ask of the, I made a joking reference on Twitter this morning that the future of news is a future of conferences about the future of news, which was my most retweeted tweet ever. There's a lesson in there somewhere. But what I would love to see someone do in the academic world is a true audit of what kinds of information we truly had in traditional media vehicles and where does that information sit today on the web. I'm not suggesting there aren't holes. There are holes. But I really wish we'd get beyond this romanticized revisionist history of what traditional media did. And I love, my father worked for the Providence Journal. I love newspapers, so don't get me wrong. But let's really look at hard facts. What coverage existed then, how much investigative reporting was done then, where is it being done now, and again, where are the holes? And I think if we look at that kind of analysis, we'll probably see far fewer holes than we would think. And I think we have good reason for optimism to find how those holes will be filled going forward.
John Rames?
Well, I guess the topic here is what can be done to strengthen it. And one of the things that I think that's just a funny tweet there, and it brings me to the point, and that is that there's a lot of talk about what is wrong, a lot of talk about this, and frankly, there's a lot of whining. There's a lot of whining about what happened in Detroit and cars aren't being sold. There's whining about big box retailers and being consolidated, and classifieds going away. There's a lot less talk about what anybody's doing about it, and I think that from our standpoint, or my standpoint, one of the themes about today is that everybody says the brand is still important, being trusted is important, have a filtered editor is important. All of these things are important. And those things are all going to be continue to be important to advertisers. Nobody really this morning or this afternoon talks about that connection. I think that advertisers always want to have that connection, and as long as that profit motive is there, I think that they'll gravitate to that. And I think that a lot of, whether it's newspaper or television stations, who, by the way, shouldn't refer to themselves as just newspaper or television stations. They need to launch other things that make a difference. You know, Nancy, I've seen some of the things that you're doing over there at the Star Tribune. Rick used to work with us and all the things that is going on there. On our standpoint, we launch other businesses. We launch things like Metro Mix for entertainment. We have Moms Like Me site. We had 1.5 million people view a live birth last week on Moms Like Me. So the point is you have to use the things that are important to you now and get into these other businesses and connect advertisers.
Okay, who can connect up to what John's saying about content and the relationship content to advertisers? Paula.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the advertiser part since I'm public television, but I do think that you're right. I mean, this is, you know, the irony is this would be the most extraordinary time if we could figure out the revenue side, because the ability to be able to reach out and connect with people that can use our services is profound. I think from my own business and the creators of the first generation of those that created our public television stations had a vision of how to use this powerful medium of television to reach out. And through all the work that we've done, particularly in the new media space, we're doing the thing that we had talked about for many years, is finally connecting with a very different audience. Our online audience is, 48% of our online audience is under the age of 35. That's with the kids stripped out. We have about 11 million kids that come on a monthly basis to our site. And as one would guess, the broadcast audience for public television tends to be over 55. So this is a whole other group. Looking specifically at the news side of the business, at the NewsHour, the online NewsHour audience is are not the same people that are watching the NewsHour on television. So to be able to extend that reach, I think, is profoundly powerful. And to be able to think about the content for smartphones, to think about the content on an on-demand basis, to be able to have material that's archived, that can be accessible whenever people want to reach it. I mean, this is an extraordinarily powerful moment for us. I think in public media, we have an advantage that commercial media doesn't, in that we have a diversified revenue stream. And so I think we do have the ability to make connection with individuals, which in essence, our members are people that have paid for our services, 50%, more than 50% for most of our stations. The lion's share of the revenue comes from individual philanthropy. Foundation support, the 15% of our funding that comes from the federal government, being able to leverage that all together, as well as our corporate partners, I think make us an important part of the answer of how do we look at journalism moving forward. But I think the thing that needs to happen, and it's been commented on a few times in the last panel, is partnerships. I mean, public radio, public television should be working together. I'm glad I'm here at a public radio meeting. I think it's tremendously important that, because our strengths are not in the same areas, I think partnerships between newspapers and public television and public radio is tremendously important, because each brings something profoundly different to the mix. And I think the other thing is that we need to look at people like Min Post, wherever you are. There you are. You should be at the table too. I mean, I think that if we're able to align different organizations and can pull the material together in a platform where people can find the information that they're looking for, I think we will have done something much more significant than the old days of journalism that we're now lamenting.
Well, let me turn to Bill Davis of KPCC, SPCR in Southern California. Bill, you heard what Paula said. And how do you relate to that?
I think she makes a perfectly good point. Historically, public broadcasting entities haven't worked very well together. We try to play in the same sandbox. We've had some limited successes. Clearly, we need to do more in that regard. But there are also, I mean, as we move to a multi-platform production model where all of us have similar production costs and similar revenue drivers, the opportunity to have that kind of interaction is going to increase. Right now, one of the benefits that public radio enjoys is that it doesn't cost us very much to produce our content. And it's really cheap. Public television has to have a level of video production, editing, post-production, et cetera, that we are blissfully unhindered by. And so I think that, you know, those kinds of aspects, whether they're partnerships or whether they're changes at governance levels or funding levels, will be in the future. But we need to be doing more things like we did on the elections, like some of the things that you mentioned, Pat, in terms of the economy and the mortgage crisis.
Very good. Joaquin, what can you add?
You know, what strikes me is that we still are talking about this, and Charlie's heard this before. We still describe this in terms of the impact of digital on this space, and really what we're talking about is the impact of the network. And what a network scientist would tell you is that, you know, hyperlocalism kind of equates to packetized transfer of data across the network, which can then be recombined in new ways. We need to make sure that in these conversations we have the network folks, that we have application developers sitting at the table. You don't get to the iPhone by having a conversation like this, right? You pretty much close your doors, don't tell anyone what you're doing, and try to kill everybody else. And who knew that there were 3 billion applications waiting to get downloaded? To Pat's point, if we want to bring new people in, let's look in this room and who's not sitting in this room right now, and let's invite them in as quickly as possible. I agree with John, too much whining. What do we stand to gain here, folks? I mean, we do have a literacy crisis in this country. What are we doing about it? I mean, we're not going to have anyone who cares about the newspaper at the rate that we're going with public education. What are we doing about it? And as the federal government put $7 billion into broadband, what are we doing to ensure that where communities do receive those grants, that there is a strong public interest media component to how that money gets placed into this American infrastructure? We are leveraging a tremendous amount of debt on the backs of future generations who will not be equipped with the education or the workplace to actually ever pay it off at the rate that we're going. So we should really be smart in the next couple of months as those dollars start to flow out to ensure that working between public media, universities, the for-profit sector, and foundations, that we are addressing community health in a way, information health, that is properly mapped. There's too many lists on PowerPoint slides. We need a map, which we started to work on, but we need a map of where stuff is. How many people can identify in their zip code how many foundation dollars have gone into any kind of public media? Right? So for all the talk, there are actually a number of resources already out there which are not properly networked together. We don't exist in a sector that actually knows how to network itself properly. And in the age of the network, that's suicide.
Josh Silver, talk to us from the standpoint of your niche.
Wow, that's a wide open one. Well, thanks, Victor. I was thinking about what Richard said earlier, and it is a little bit of a shift from Joaquin. But I think it's important for us to all keep in mind that change is nearly always brought by policy, and if it's not brought by policy, it's enabled by policy change. So in the same way that innovation is needed and we talked about it a lot in the first session, policy changes need to keep up with and sometimes be ahead of such innovation to foster it. It was policy in 1967 that created this whole system, and we were behind Europe significantly by several decades at the time that the Carnegie Commission moved the Public Broadcasting Act. But I think 42 years later, we are in a situation where, because of failures in policy, we have a systematic problems with the system that are the result of failures in that policy. Namely, I believe maybe the largest being Fred Friendly, his ominous warning that said if you rely on an annual appropriation, this system is going to be, I think he used the word, a disaster. So I think we have to recognize that the system is grossly underfunded. It is unduly subject to political influence. And there's some statistics that people should think about. In response to what Mr. Sweeney said earlier, let's think about this. AIG, one company, has received 175 times more money from the federal government this year than the CPB. The U.S. government has spent 3.5 times more money than the CPB received this year simply on contracting out furniture. So imagine if they used IKEA, we could probably double the CPB budget. I mean, really, this is we have to keep some perspective. Yeah, just earmarks alone, 41 times more than the CPB budget. So, you know, and the notion that we don't have a problem in newsrooms is ludicrous. Commercial newsrooms are failing, and there's different versions and different reasons, but they are not, you know, they're shedding reporters very quickly, and these are the reporters who do get the idea of fact-checking. They get the idea of the kind of veracity and reliability that our democracy requires, and the real fear is that if we don't adapt quickly, we are going to lose those reporters that we can rely on, and they'll go into different trades, and we're going to lose the fourth estate, the fabric of the fourth estate, which are the people doing the reporting. We can look to all these innovative online solutions, but we must remember that because, again, of failed policy in Washington, nearly 40% of Americans don't have broadband at home. Nearly 40%. And of course, they are disproportionately poor, they're rural, and they're people of color. So we have to keep in mind, and I'm heartened by the fact that we're linking these issues of infrastructure and media content, because that's absolutely essential to figuring out the solution. So I do want to, I think I'll close on that, but be candid in the reality that I think most of us know in this room, which is if we're going to change this, it's going to take tremendous, tremendous political will. It's going to take a movement. It's going to take everyone going from the countless conferences talking about the problem and visioning what the solutions are to recognizing that we actually have some great solutions in front of us. The Knight Commission report is excellent. The Len Downey report is excellent. Bill Kling's, just his short 4-pager is excellent. And we have a vision. I dare say it is time to start segueing away from searching for the vision and start really focusing all these amazing people in this room and elsewhere on how do we build the movement and the political leverage to win the changes we need.
Vince, let me ask you, with respect to what Josh just said, do we have the structures? Do we have a way of organizing to do what he's talking about doing? Because I'm not sure I see those structures.
Well, I think we do have some of the structures. I would really just go back a couple of points to say we need the right people in the structures, too. And I'm as white and middle-aged and male as the next guy, literally. But, well, not you, you're not middle-aged. But anyway, no offense, to myself included, I think Joaquin's point is extremely important, and Pat, I think you pointed it up, too. This is the third meeting on the future of news that I've been to in 7 days. So, you know, I think it's really important that we not see each other 3 times in a row. But the first meeting I was at, it was a meeting at CUNY on new business models for news. It was a very dynamic group of people who were actually building these new tools, and quite a lot of them were under 30. So I think it's really good to get people who are under 30 to plug into systems and structures that have been around with us for decades. And I think the public media system as a structure is one that is very viable for the future of news. And I would say, like, for every $10 billion that commercial media loses from one year to the next, if we could pick up $1 billion and plug it into the non-commercial public media sector, we would get enormous value out of that. Not that there's any obvious way to do that, but I would just point to an interesting moment about a month ago in New York when I was happy to be with Laura Walker and friends at Carnegie Hall, where we, we christened the rebirth of WQXR on the broadcast from Carnegie Hall of the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra. And it was a very clever and civically minded deal that WNYC was able to execute with a civic-minded publisher, the New York Times, to transfer that property to WNYC. The same week, Condé Nast chose to shut down Gourmet magazine. And when they saw that Bon Appetit was losing ad pages at a lower rate than Gourmet, they did the simple thing that you would do in that calculation. They shut down the magazine that was doing less well economically. And so I think those two choices really point up the distinction between a mission-driven public media enterprise working with a civically minded for-profit publishing company to sustain the public service of a classical music station. At the same time, a commercial enterprise took its McKinsey report and ran the numbers and shut down the one that wasn't doing as well financially, even though I think any subscriber to both magazines would have to say that Ruth Reichel had put in articles about farm and agricultural policy, farm labor rules, and a much more serious implication of what we put in front of us as food, and not just a recipe magazine. So,
Great point.
that's useful.
John.
How are you? Thank you for inviting me here to this august bunch. I'm here kind of...
Don't start with a note of sarcasm.
Because, you know, to have a small newspaper executive editor here, you know, there are 321 or 327 weeklies and dailies out there that continue to deal with the strengthening every day, strengthen local news. Here's the deal. You know, as executive editor, I think one of the ways I strengthen local news is to set and uphold the standards so we don't back off on things like sourcing or doing it the right way. I also try to spend a lot of time going out there and interviewing talent and trying to convince the best talent to try to find the best people, I don't care what age they are or whatever it is, to come on into our businesses because we've got tremendous audience. Okay, our paper, for instance, you know, we're an information company. If you want news, we've got mobile sites, we've got our website, 5.4 million people coming on each day. You know, strong circulation.
What's your circulation?
Well, 24,000 on a good day daily, 34,000 on Sunday. The readership of that's enough on Sunday to fill every seat in the Metrodome plus the floor.
What do you charge for your Sunday paper?
Right now, $1.50 per issue. Good value? I think so. Somebody sent me a note, said, you know, you've had to cut back a little bit, and what's the value? And I got a good editor's column coming up this Sunday, I think, saying there's lots of value to it. But the whole point, I think, is for us to really focus on, we talk about strengthen local journalism. We do that by knowing our communities, by spending time in the communities, talking to people, finding out what they really care about. You know, for all the weeklies in Minnesota, for all the dailies in Minnesota, everybody who works there to go out and get news considers themselves an investigative reporter. You sit through some city council meetings or school board meetings, you'll know what it's like to do investigative journalism because you go afterwards and try to come up with stories. So I think that's the way that we strengthen the local journalism. And, you know, the thing that worries me, I was at a panel, or I sat in the audience at a panel at one of our colleges, and it worried me a little bit with all this talk because people are thinking of careers in journalism. And we're very vibrant. And so let's not discourage the innovation and creativity that needs to come into the newsroom.
Do you have any idea what is happening in the journalism schools right now in terms of enrollment? Does anybody have an idea?
But here's the question.
Is that because they're dodging the job market? Huh?
There is actually meaningful content out there and a legitimate, solid amount of it. But the way we've been doing what we're doing in online space, in journalism over the years, it is harder and harder to find. I mean, even if you're on the page, it can be very hard to find. So what we're doing right now is hiring journalists whose job it is first and foremost to find in our local marketplace the best journalism that is out there day to day. We drive people to it. We don't embed it. The idea is to help people figure out where to look for the most meaningful news, and wherever possible, to provide greater context for that specific report.
Give me an example, a concrete example of how you've done that in a particular story or particular case.
We have a governor who's pretty active these days in a lot of spaces outside Minnesota, and a couple of weeks ago had was making news for his first big PAC dinner in Washington, D.C. And what we did was, first and foremost, we went to the place where he was putting together that meeting, where people were paying, I don't remember how many thousands of bucks a plate to come in and meet him and see him. And we took the local story there and looked at what the Washington Post and the Capitol Hill paper were doing around that. We looked at what his own source was doing, timpaleni.gov or .com, his own site of his own. We also looked at what some of the major papers were doing and other news organizations here in Minnesota around it. So contextualizing it in the sense that we look at about a half different sources of news and information around that one event, traditional and non-traditional news sources, and advance that. We not only post it at Bring Me the News, we advance it through social media channels, and we have a radio arm that will advance it as well, building a radio network simultaneously. So that's a recent example of how we're moving into this new space. It's premised on the fact, again, that there is content out there that is in fact meaningful. It is harder and harder to know where to look to find it.
Beth, Courtney, do you have a comment?
A couple of things. One of them I was thinking about is I wake up every day. Although I'm on the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I'm the president of Louisiana Public Broadcasting, and every day we have an opportunity to fill vast holes. Anything we do helps dramatically. We are a trusted source of news and information, and I guess one of the things that came to me was that at one moment in time we were sort of the epicenter of all world news following Katrina. We were headquartered in Baton Rouge, which was the first high ground out of the storm. So I saw all of the world's news media sort of show up, public broadcasting, newspapers, everyone, the best and the worst of everyone. But I found out what was our role at that point in time. One, we were a trusted source. Two, people didn't see us as competitive edge or anything. They saw us using this infrastructure that had been invested in by CPB, federal government, NTIA, to use as sending out information, but also to partner with others, to partner with public radio where it was necessary, to partner with commercial operations, to partner with newspapers who had to evacuate out of New Orleans. And I saw many opportunities for us to do this. The other thing that we needed to do, though, was to spend an entire year following 6 individuals for a year from the storm. So in depth. That's one of the things we need to do, and we are valued for it, you know, in the community.
These were people who lost their homes?
Yes. We followed them for a year, and now we're looking at the coastal erosion problem, following it later. I guess I would say to you, if you are a valued part of the community, and I think every public broadcaster has to have some sort of outreach operation in their community, or they won't survive. They have to be engaged with their communities. And as a CPB board member, I hope that radio and TV will learn in this new space, or these new spaces we're talking about, how to work together better. And I think we all want to do that. It's difficult to see those new ways, but I think we can absolutely do that. And I, frankly, feel more of kinship with newspapers in my part of the world. There's still some family-owned newspapers down there, and we actually have more rapport than some of my commercial colleagues, you know, in doing long-form stories together. One final thought, mentioned earlier in the panel, and that is we have a particular role in education. We are the trusted source in schools. We have an online service, password protected, that has content. So news content goes into classrooms. There, we have an incredibly important role to play. we sending out, but to get it back from some of our tech schools, and Joaquin and I know this, we have broadband connections where you'd never think they would be there in the bayou. We're trying to learn from them and then give young people a greater voice in some of the old media that we're doing as well.
Well, that's a great story. Thinking of you during that period after the storm. I mean, that's an amazing place to be for you.
Right.
Rich, you were trying to say something useful. I didn't mean just for
I'll try.
just for the time.
I was just going to respond to the comment about journalism schools. I mean, I think on the one hand, it's great that enrollments are up. I think it's unfortunate that the journalism schools, I don't think are really teaching people the right things in coming into this profession, because of course the space is evolving. You know, I mean, as I said, I'm optimistic, but the news landscape of the future is dramatically different in every dimension than the landscape of the past. And in fact, as I look at the space, what I've been preaching to folks is we really need to rethink every part of it, every dimension of it. You know, how it's gathered, who it's gathered by, how it's presented, how it's structured.
Who's the we?
We, anyone who thinks of themselves as being in the news business. And I mean that broadly, so the blogger in his underwear to the New York Times. What are the roles of the participants? What's the role of an editor going forward? What's the role of a reporter? What's the workflow process that gets you there? All of that stuff has to be rethought because it's all different. And I'm not saying it all gets tossed, but you got to rethink it. And so to me, what that says about journalism schools, and we can enlarge this to anyone working in the space, is the things that I find discouraging is we're not in the journalism schools teaching people, working with students to figure out how do they rethink the model, the product model, the framework in which they present content. And it's understandable. Magazines have been around for over 100 years and they've never changed functionally. It's a sheaf of papers that is bound. It's got a table of contents and articles. You can redesign it, make it look pretty, give it a different editorial focus, but the function is the same, right? But the online space is different and is changing all the time. We didn't think about social media 3 years ago. We think about social media today. That's going to be different again in 3 years. So how do we encourage, and I find this a challenge with working journalists, including in my own organization, is how do I get them to think beyond the framework that they've always worked within? How do I get them to not only think outside the box, but to recreate new boxes? So how do we think about the form and structure, which I think is going to change dramatically as we go forward and should? How do we get them to think about how they, as journalists and editors, can be effective? And I think there's a huge win in this, at how do they harvest the efforts and contributions of those people out there who can be trusted to participate? And I don't mean to be thousands, but hundreds of folks who can help. And third, which is, to me, it is an old bugaboo of mine, is how do we teach journalists to actually think and understand the business model? And in the past, unfortunately, what we've taught them is the reverse, that somehow it's unethical for them to understand the underpinnings of the business that they're working in. And that's just plain wrong, particularly as we move into this new world where the business model is so dramatically different. We haven't all figured it out. But to simply sit there and think that the business model is what the guys do on the other side, of the walls in the sales department that's selling ads against the articles I write is utterly simplistic and not productive in terms of helping these people become productive components of that landscape going forward. Because I think many of them are going to be individual contributors, in a sense, working alone, doing their own little businesses of one form or another.
Well, good. As soon as we figure out what the business model is, we'll inject it into the schools. Yeah, Charlie Firestone.
I don't know if we want to go off on journalism education, but if you look at the comment that Tom Rosenstiel made earlier today about unbundling the functions of journalism, and you think about those functions, I have a slightly different list, and if we're teaching that in the journalism schools, which I expect we are, certainly when I visited USC Annenberg, I thought that they were doing all of this, which is fact-finding, verification, authentication, contextualization, analysis, editing, filtering, aggregation, linking, and agenting, all those different functions. That's kind of a reorientation of a liberal education. You need a foundation as well. But these are the skills of a 21st century person who's thinking, who's researching, and contextualizing and analyzing. So I think, you know, people can go to journalism school and have an education beyond journalism, just like you can go to law school and have a career beyond the law. If I could take another minute, I was partner in the formation of the Knight Commission, which has been mentioned a couple times, which tried to look at this issue from the demand side, from, you know, what do communities need in a democracy? And, you know, basically they found that the information needs are enormous and they're never going to be filled completely, and certainly not totally by the market. But I will say that the market is evolving, and there was a tweet a little bit earlier from Ewan McKenna who said, you know, you're talking about innovation being young people. It's a state of mind. There are people, there are companies who are adapting, who are changing. One of the problems is that the companies, the newspaper companies, almost all of the major newspapers are saddled by huge debt service. I've talked to a number of editors who say that their newspapers actually has a, you know, positive margin, but the debt service is putting them under and putting them into bankruptcy, including the Chicago Tribune, which claims that they're running an 18%. I don't know if that's public, but said that he was running at a margin. So, well, they're in bankruptcy. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the we'll bleep this. Yeah, whatever. But the point is that you know, there's a lot of experimentation, and if you separate all those functions, which, as Tom said, you know, we're having an unbundling, and you take the different models of revenue, all the different revenue models, which include advertising, subscriptions, fees, micropayments, barter, co-op, corporate underwriting, philanthropy, endowments, and government, what you're going to see over the next, I think, 5 to 10 years is a period of experimentation of various functions being supported by various sources of revenue. And it's just going to be trying one thing after another, and some people will come up with resolutions and some won't. Just one last point, which is that another thing that the commission found was that information is also a public good and that it needs public support. And so they were very supportive of the public media. They felt that public broadcasting should be public service media and be local, diverse, and interactive, but needed a much greater support from our country in supporting that. And in some other materials that we've worked on, we saw with CPB and some other activities that they need, you know, a constant theme here: funding, leadership, and the question I have is structure. That's the one that I think, structure and culture, that is going to be a very difficult thing to overcome, to the extent that that's a barrier.
Yeah. Bill?
I think that structure issue is spot on. And, you know, Josh, you were talking earlier about the policy ramifications, and there's a sensitive dependence upon initial conditions, right? When we started in 1967, I don't think anybody who was writing the Public Broadcasting Act would have imagined that probably more like 80% of all the public radio stations in the country are licensed to colleges, universities, local government entities. And to the extent that that got us off the ground, that was fine. But as we've gone over these past 42 years, the organizations, the institutions that have succeeded most in this space are the ones that have independent boards of trustees who are not constrained by the larger goals of a state university or what have you. And Vince, you were mentioning the success that Laura Walker's had at WNYC. You know, there's no question that she's done great things, but she's had a level of civic leadership and a level of civic commitment from her board of trustees that has been second to none. And what I would say is, you know, if public radio and public broadcasting is going to play a role in strengthening local or regional journalism, I think the critical issue is civic leadership. The boards of trustees or public radio stations getting out of their current governance model to where they can engage with civic leadership within their communities on fundraising, on outreach, on diversity, on all of these questions. I think that's as critical, or maybe even more critical, as what we're teaching in journalism schools or who we're hiring and how we're doing those things.
Pat, don't we need to enlist more billionaires?
Well, I wouldn't put it more billionaires, but I think it goes to, I forgot his name, the point about leadership. And there are people like Bill Kling or Laura Walker who, when they look to identify people to serve on a board, do not pick the lowest common denominator. Leadership means that you need to surround yourself with the best and the brightest, no matter where they come from. And when you have that, then you start thinking outside of the box. And you're absolutely right. It's not an age-related thing in terms of innovation or being a change agent, but you have to be willing to be leading the change yourself, which means you can't be fearful of somebody who may have new ideas, who may be bright, in ways that your experience has not unfolded. And at CPB, we are reaching out to people. I understand maybe half of what Joaquin says, but that's not the point.
You're ahead of the game.
Yeah, you know. And that's, I think, to keep the stuff that works that's good, but not be afraid, not be so stuck in an old model. And you're so right. In terms of trustees, boards of directors, they are critical. They're the civic leaders who can perhaps help us get to that new construct and the funding that makes sense. Because if we are the people who are promoting democracy at a time when we really need as much information, not in a tsunami sort of way, but information that helps us make life decisions, then it's got to be funded appropriately.
Nancy, I want to come back to you in just a moment, but keying off what Pat just said, is there a big problem out there for public media in terms of our identification with left-of-center politics? I'm asking Paul.
Yes.
Yeah, we're looking at each other. No, I don't think so. I think that our biggest problem is I think leadership is a huge issue. I think our willingness to come together and look at what each type of organization brings to the table and not tripping over one another to duplicate, but to take the strengths of, we've been in deep discussions with NPR about looking at ways, and you see that now. You see NPR reporters on the NewsHour. You see NewsHour reporters on NPR. You see even within our own business, frontline reporters, part of, so I think we've been siloed for so bloody long, and I think we don't have the luxury to do that anymore. And at the end of the day,
take you on. Do you really would say that we don't have a political problem in terms of what I've called left-of-center politics? Is that?
I would say no. I used to run a station, and I used to get as many calls from people that said we were too conservative as we did that we were too liberal. I don't see that we have a problem.
Paul?
I think there is a problem, and I suppose we can argue about how much of it is perception and how much of it is reality. I think.
Well, I'm talking about perception.
I think there's no question there's a problem in terms of perception, and at Southern California Public Radio, KPCC, we look at the breakdown of our audience, and in fact, it very closely tracks with the political demographics of Southern California in terms of how many people identify as Republicans or conservatives or independents. So in terms of the people who actually listen to us, it tracks pretty closely to the population. My concern is more about people who don't know about us, are not familiar with us, and who I think are more familiar with that line of thinking that, public radio, that's that liberal, left of center, socialist, whatever.
Yeah.
So to my mind, that comes back to more of an education / marketing problem as much as anything. Because people who are, our general manager takes a train with a guy who they got to talking one day, and he said he works for public radio, and he said, public radio, that's that that left-wing thing, and he said, "You listen to it?" He said, "No, and, you know, I'm very conservative." He said, "Well, try it out. Listen to it for a little bit." And the guy ended up being a regular, daily, dedicated listener, because as he started to listen to us, he found out that we actually take a very balanced approach to the news. So I think there is a perception problem, and it becomes an education problem.
I had a funny thing. After a golf game, we were sitting at the lunch table at a club in Los Angeles, which is not exactly a fountainhead of liberal sentiment. Quite the opposite. And but I always take these polls. So there are actually about 12 guys in the room, all men, of course. And I said, "How many of you listened to KPCC?" Which in this case it was Los Angeles, of course. And to my delight, 8 of them raised their hands. And I said, "Well, that's very interesting, considering that you're all rock-ribbed Republicans." They said, "Yes, it's sort of leftist, but it's got such great stuff, we listen." Which I thought was great tribute. But it still suggests a problem. Nancy.
I want to go back to the question of who should strengthen local journalism. And first of all, say all of us. I mean, this shouldn't be public radio or old media or new media or, you know, the next best thing to come along. The answer is yes. We all need to be strengthening local and regional journalism. It's very fundamental to who we are as a society. One of the ways in which we can do that, and you mentioned it briefly, is to leverage the power of the community that we have around us. Somebody in one of the earlier sessions mentioned, you know, sort of the power of the community on Facebook. I've been a big fan of Minnesota Public Radio's Public Insight Journalism, which is a way of getting the community to contribute information. At the newspaper, we started a community-contributed blog. We call it The Whistleblower, where the community contributes ideas for investigations, and then we go out and investigate what they have suggested. We found some tremendous stories there. Twitter feeds can give you great tips on stories. So all of us as news media organizations, old or young, new, traditional, if we leverage the power that our community has and the information that is out there beyond the boundaries of our own organizations, we will strengthen the local journalism.
Good stuff. We're going to do a quick trip now because I want to get to the audience with the people whose nameplates are up. So, Joaquin?
The moon landing was referenced earlier, and recently there was the L-Cross mission, which essentially crashed a Winnebago into one of the hidden parts of the moon to discover water. And I knew a bunch of the folks working for NASA on L-Cross, and they said, "We don't have any money, so we're doing a startup, and we're going to crash a Winnebago into the moon," basically. And it went from this story of the heroic person with the flag to, holy, you know what, there's water on the moon. We've got to evolve our thinking away from, oh, it's lefty this, it's right that, it's Republican this, it's Democrat that. I don't think people think like that all the time. Especially the younger you go, the more diverse you go. That's not the same thing anymore. And if we think in those terms, we'll only recreate what's not working right now. We have to think about the ecosystem that is out there. And if you take something like public insight journalism, that is a network application for the network age. It is a network application of community knowledge in a journalistic API, basically. That's the kind of smart stuff that we should be doing more of.
John?
Just kind of dovetailing on some of the things I've been talking about here. We talked a lot about teens and recruiting new people coming up, reading news, and I started thinking about how bored to death my teens would be if they were here today. That's just a fact. I mean, I own and
thanks a
operate
lot.
too. No, it's just part of it. It's just part of, you know, having the guts to be different, try something. And I get stuck in this, and I'm sure all of us do in different ways, where, you know, somebody's looking at us trying to do the right thing, and it's very, very difficult to do something different and have the guts to do it. I don't know if anybody likes football, but last night, Bill Belichick of the New England Patriots went for it on 4th and 1 at his own 29. Who does that? Nobody. Guys with guts do it, and it makes a difference. Yeah,
What?
Stupidity. No,
John.
Stupidity or guts.
John, what's the lesson there?
The lesson is to have gut. No, I'll tell you, he already knows he's going to win, so he can do whatever he wants.
That
That's
was the dumbest call in the history of football.
And
He's got the
face it.
rings.
And if you,
Yeah, are you going to really make a lesson
inch,
out of that?
You wouldn't be saying. What would you be saying if you made it and you don't know that?
It's like what not happened is important, huh? No. But thank you very much. Let's see. Josh?
Okay, I'm from Massachusetts. I'm completely demoralized.
He had guts.
I did want to respond to stuff, and I'm going to be very quick.
It's got to be quick.
I think Joaquin's point is very good, which is we have to face the fact that this left-right paradigm is not helpful, and it is antiquated. It's not where the young people are. It is a successful meme that libertarians, and I'd say some on the far right, have injected into the debate to sort of discredit ideas they don't agree with. But as long as public media representatives are comfortable saying we try to bring factual, objective information to the public, that's what we do. You can call it whatever you want, but that's our job. But what I really want to say is that and in the spirit of sticking to the agenda, the thoughtful agenda here, is at the end of the day, we have a very fundamental question before us, and that is there sufficient private revenue in the form of advertising, subscribers, in philanthropy, and some of the other revenue models that Charlie mentioned, sufficient to provide the information needs of our society, locally, nationally, and internationally? Everything I see says no, there is not. And so that doesn't mean that we throw away the idea of private innovation. Private innovation is crucial, and it's a huge piece of this. But we also have to acknowledge that the public subsidy part is equally huge and has to be tackled. So, and last idea is if you're not comfortable with that, then keep in mind there's other policy changes too that might be more palatable that you can still be very helpful with. Changing tax code, make it easier for organizations that produce news to enjoy tax-exempt status, or an L3C if that works, or what have you. So it's not an either-or, and I think there's a lot of room for different approaches, and that's what's going to be needed.
Well, Josh, you have to confess, however, that as a nation, we're under-resourced in all our public areas today. We are so we're not being discriminated against here in relation to public journalism. We are desperately under-resourced at the most basic levels of this country. Vince and Chris get the last words.
Well, so we have talked a little bit about the young people who aren't in the room, a little bit, maybe I set it off. Not to say that older people can't be innovative. So it's not that they have a monopoly on innovation under 30, but certainly they ought to be represented. I don't think anybody would really argue with that. And one way I think we can touch on this is, there's so many great innovations here in this building. I'm so excited to be here. The last time I was in this room was for a demonstration of PIJ, Public Insight Journalism, and it has been fantastic. And it has the potential of revolutionizing the craft of journalism. I'll just say that. But the other thing that's cool about NPR is go back to your hotel and tune into 89.3. It's one of the only strong public media enterprises that is doing a really significant effort to reach a younger audience. And The Current is doing a really excellent job of reaching that younger audience with the latest music from Dave Grohl's new band. But at the same time, they have an event called Policy in a Pint, where they invite that audience to come out and talk about policy in a brew pub where they're comfortable talking about it. And Carl Castle is not invited. God bless him, but that's not the voice they're listening to. And we need to serve diverse portions to people the way they consume it.
What a great example that is. Chris.
I just wanted to be sure that the point doesn't get lost on the emphasis on news leadership as well. The point was made a number of times around the table about civic leadership and leadership at the board level. I think public media would also benefit from news leadership. I mean, there's some wonderful news people in the market that I think would help transform the way public media views news gathering, and really in getting more of a news sensibility in the DNA of public media.
Well, let's turn to the audience now. We've got a few minutes left. Yes, sir. Up there.
I'm Len Witt, and I run the Center for Sustainable Journalism at Kennesaw State. And I have a question for the CPB people. There's quite a few of you here, and it kind of ties into what Josh was saying. You can start a newsroom or run a newsroom. The Christian Science Monitor is doing it for about $7 million a year if it's all online, which would be the equivalent of 80 correspondents they have, including international. So every time you could put together a $7 million package, you could have a newsroom of 80 people. And if you did it across the country, you would come to about $422 million, which I think, is that your annual budget, somewhere in there? So you might not want to go for all 50 states, but for helping Josh out, you might want to say, all right, $7 million here. This is a newsroom with 80 people that could do public journalism. And if you come to a place like Georgia, 80 people's a lot of people for public, news. And a lot of your money, like Len Downey pointed out in his report, is not going to news. I mean, a very small fraction of the money is actually getting down to news. So, reaction at all?
It speaks to what Paula Kerger said earlier, working in partnership with NPR. We're right now investing in, can I talk about this? I don't know if the contract's, but anyway, a series of local journalism centers, too late now, where economies of scale in terms of bringing people from various stations together and journalists in a totally new model, not building it on an old model, totally focused on local news, local information. Granted, we're starting with just a few stations, but it can be a template for that kind of investment going down the road. And we've also launched Project Argo, which was done in conjunction with the Knight Commission report. You're absolutely right. There needs to be a reinvigoration of investment in journalism, and we're doing it in a way that we haven't done before, working with both PBS and NPR.
Thank you, Pat. Yes. Did you
Great.
have a question?
Yes, Steve Clift with edemocracy.org. We do online town halls in 15 different communities. We've been doing it since '94. Public media still very much feels like broadcast to me. And the new medium that I experience is highly interactive. It's friends and family, and it's in private life. So two problems I'd like a quick comment from someone on the panel about. The problem is that most of this interactivity is social media in private life, not local geographic public life. The second problem is that online news, as it's actually approaching commenting, is the lowest of the low. The worst kind of interactivity I see anywhere on the web is often on local newspaper websites with the commenting. So we have a problem. The expectations about public life and social media aren't mixing together in the right way.
Comment?
I think it's really hard to capture all the things that are happening within the federally funded public media activities in this country. I think it needs to be mapped a lot better. Some stations do great, some don't have the capacity to do it. I think also that it's hard to gauge where the outcome actually is. Even if you do those things, we don't necessarily understand how deep that impact is. And on the interactivity space, look at what TechSoup Global does in terms of their NetSquare challenge. That's a nice model that can, and in some cases, is applied in the public media space.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is where I started this morning, I think that most people who produce journalism today think that that's their producing content and pushing it out. That's antiquated. That is not what Joaquin, or at least as what I understand Joaquin is talking about, and that's not what I think you're talking about. And the journalism that's going to survive is a journalism that informs an ongoing conversation and is part of it, helps convene it, and is respectful of the participation of people. That it's it's, you know, we really have to move beyond the idea that we're the experts giving a lecture and maybe suffering a few comments and a little input. It's so fundamentally different than that. And everybody in this room is going to be out of business, whether it's publicly funded or privately funded, if they don't get that.
Did you have one more question from the audience?
My name is Janice Lane Ewart. I'm Executive Director of KFAI Fresh Air Radio here in the Twin Cities. And I was very happy to hear you, Ms. Harrison, talk about templates and particularly the new soon to be fully announced Strengthening Local Journalism, as we had an interest in that. And I really wanted to address the viewpoint of who will undertake the challenge. And I would say that there are many small stations that are making contributions toward this challenge, particularly in communities such as ours, where there are anywhere from 12 to 120 different languages spoken in the course of a schoolroom. And there are communities that are still very oral and are dependent upon radio for maintaining investigative news as well as a sense of culture and mores. And I'm curious to find out how we can move forward with a financial model that provides support for smaller stations that make vital contributions in ways that are not necessarily taken up by larger stations, but are also important for moving the topics forward and moving the tradition of radio upwards.
Pat, is that a CPB responsibility?
Yes, and thank you. I'm really fortunate that the board of directors of CPB is here, and I am going to turn that question over to them to consider.
I'm not going to call that a cop-out. Well, okay, let me read questions that people have been kind enough to put in print. From Ewan McKenna, what about the role of entrepreneurship? This entire panel is talking about the future of news, but the future of news is probably not in that room. With the decentralization of media, there's going to be startups and competition from news sources. How do the old sources plan to adjust? Not only are they competing with each other, but they're competing with their consumers. Comment from Michael Griffin. The problem with journalism schools isn't just or even primarily not being up to date on technology or social media. It's a deeper, more long-standing problem having to do with the same questions considered at this conference. What is most valuable and important about the practice of journalism? Journalism schools tend to gravitate towards entrenched interests and money. It's a cynic.
If I could, to the first question. Yes, this notion of a lack of entrepreneurship, obviously that's what we're rooted in. And it's interesting. I mean, I've watched this panel evolve the discussion, and it's been largely about public radio. I started in public radio. I'm a fan of it. All outward appearances are they're doing very well here in Minnesota. It's a bit to journalism what the Vatican is to my Catholic faith. It's really impressive. I want to say, though, that the entrepreneurship value here, I'm good to see the audience engaging in, because I really do believe that there is, Josh, I so thought your answer was going to be yes when you asked if this was monetizable. I thought, oh my gosh, he's going there. And then he said no. I think it is. Granted, our overhead is lower. We've only got 7 people in my operation, but we were profitable at launch, and we're growing at launch. Yeah, no, that's maybe next year's conversation.
That's a cheap shot.
We haven't gone public
I apologize.
yet. Yeah, but no. So. There is a way to monetize news in this environment. One of the things, you know what? Journalism, I think, has suffered a lot from the same problem that I've seen in healthcare. And that is that what we have is an institution that has been built by folks that are not the consumers, by folks who are not looking at this from a consumer perspective so much. Healthcare built by providers and payers, the relevancy, the constituency, the voice of the patient, not so present. And that's what I recognize when I look at what's going on with journalism today. It's very hard to go to a major news organization, particularly online, and believe that that was built by or for consumers. Okay, it's very hard to find your way around, back to our original premise of what we're trying to do. And so there is opportunity in this chaos. We're working toward it, and I hope others will join us and understand that it is not necessarily looking to the government to help us make that happen.
And Rick, just let the record show, I do think you should, you can and should monetize your product, absolutely. Mine is a bigger picture question, which is there sufficient private money across the nation, across the board, in every community to meet their information needs? And I'd love to see evidence that there is, but I don't think there is.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we owe a debt of thanks to all the panelists for taking the time and thoughtfulness to be with us today.
And thank you. And thank you to you, Victor.
And to Bill Kling and his staff here, I want to say thank you.